On July the 16th, 1945, a heavy cruiser slipped out of San Francisco's Hunters Point Naval Shipyard, carrying the most dangerous cargo in human history, and almost no one aboard knew what it was. 10 days later, that cargo would be assembled into Little Boy, the atomic bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. 4 days after that, the ship that delivered it would be at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Of the 195 men aboard USS Indianapolis 879 would die, many never knowing they had helped end World War II. This is the story of the most important secret mission of the war and the worst naval disaster in American history. USS Indianapolis, hull number CA-35, was a Portland-class heavy cruiser launched in 1931. At 610 feet long and displacing nearly 10,000 tons, she was a formidable warship armed with 9 8-inch guns and 8 5-inch anti-aircraft guns. Her steam turbines could push her to 32 knots, making her one of the faster heavy cruisers in the fleet. But speed and firepower were not what made Indianapolis notable in the Navy. She had served as flagship for Admiral Raymond Spruance during the Central Pacific campaigns, present at battles from the Gilbert Islands to Okinawa. She had bombarded Japanese positions on Iwo Jima, and Okinawa shot down enemy aircraft, and survived a kamikaze strike on March 31, 1945, that killed 13 men and tore through her hull. That kamikaze hit brought Indianapolis to Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California for repairs. The damage was extensive. Her fuel tanks were ruptured, her water distillation equipment destroyed, and her propeller shafts bent. Workers repaired the structural damage, replaced equipment, and prepared the ship to return to war. By mid-July 1945, Indianapolis was ready for duty. She was not, however, ready for what came next. Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III commanded Indianapolis. A 1919 graduate of the Naval Academy, McVeigh came from Navy aristocracy. His father, Admiral Charles B. McVeigh Jr., had commanded the Asiatic Fleet. The younger McVeigh had proven himself during the war, serving as chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee, before taking command of Indianapolis in November 1944. He had led the ship through Iwo Jima, and Okinawa brought her safely home after the kamikaze strike, and earned the respect of his crew. He was 47 years old and at the peak of his career. On July the 14th, McVeigh received orders to report to the office of Rear Admiral William Purnell and Captain William Parsons. What they told him would change his life, though he could not know it at the time. The Manhattan Project, the massive secret program to develop an atomic bomb, had reached its culmination. On July the 16th, 1945, scientists detonated the world's first nuclear weapon at the Trinity test site in New Mexico. The blast was successful. The bomb worked. Now the question was how to deliver the components for the first combat atomic bomb to Tinian Island in the Marianas, where B-29 bombers would prepare to drop it on Japan. The components were divided into multiple shipments for security and redundancy. Some would fly. The most critical would travel by sea aboard the fastest available warship. That ship was Indianapolis. On July 15th, Army trucks pulled up to Hunters Point. Dock workers loaded a large wooden crate into the ship's port hangar. The crate measured approximately 15 feet long, 5 feet wide, and 5 feet high. It weighed several tons and contained the complete non-nuclear components for the Little Boy gun-type atomic bomb unit designated L-11, along with hundreds of pounds of scientific instruments and tools. A second container, much smaller, was brought aboard. This was a lead-lined steel cylinder, approximately 18 inches tall and 18 inches in diameter. It was bolted and chained to the deck in Captain McVeigh's cabin. Inside this canister were 2 85-pound discs of uranium-235, the nuclear core of the atomic bomb. This uranium represented approximately half of the United States' entire enriched uranium supply. The other half would be flown to Tinian separately. 2 men in khaki army uniforms accompanied the cargo. They gave their names as Major Robert Furman and Captain James Nolan. Neither name was entirely accurate. Nolan was actually Dr. James F. Nolan, a physician and radiological expert from the Manhattan Project's Los Alamos laboratory. He was Chief Medical Officer for Project Y, the code name for the bomb design and assembly work at Los Alamos. His mission was to monitor the uranium's radioactivity during the voyage. Furman was a military intelligence officer who had served as General Leslie Groves's courier for Manhattan Project materials. Both men traveled incognito using cover identities. They would not leave the ship during the voyage. They would remain close to the cargo at all times, and they would speak to no one about their mission. Captain McVeigh was briefed on the cargo's importance, but not its nature. He was told the crate and cylinder were critical war materials that must reach Tinian as quickly as possible. He was told that every day saved might save lives. He was told that Indianapolis must not be diverted for any reason. That last instruction came in a radio message from Admiral Ernest King himself, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet. The message was marked with the highest security classification. Lieutenant Commander Lewis Haynes, the ship's senior medical officer, saw the King message and was stunned. Under orders from the Commander-in-Chief. That meant under orders from the President himself. What could the ship possibly be carrying that warranted such priority? Haynes asked around. Some sailors speculated it was gold to pay the troops. Others thought it might be biological weapons. A few suggested it was liquor for officers. No one guessed the truth. No one could have guessed it. The concept of an atomic bomb was beyond the imagination of men who had spent 4 years fighting a conventional war. On the morning of July the 16th, 1945, the same morning, Trinity exploded in New Mexico. Indianapolis departed San Francisco Bay. Her orders were simple: proceed to Tinian at maximum sustainable speed. No stops except a brief refueling at Pearl Harbor. No delays, no diversions. Indianapolis was going to set a record. The voyage from San Francisco to Pearl Harbor normally took about 5 days. Indianapolis made it in 3.5. She maintained speeds between 25 and 29 knots, pushing her machinery hard. The crew knew they were on an unusual mission, but not why. The presence of the Army officers and the mysterious cargo in the captain's cabin fueled speculation. Dr. Nolan spent much of his time in or near Captain McVeigh's cabin, ostensibly to monitor the uranium. Radiation from the uranium-235 was minimal. The lead shielding was effective, but Nolan had orders to check it regularly. He used seasickness as an excuse for his frequent trips to the cabin. Many officers found this odd. Nolan's supposed seasickness seemed to come and go at convenient intervals. The crew noticed other peculiarities. The large crate in the hangar was guarded constantly. No one was allowed near it without authorization. When sailors asked what was inside, they were told it was classified. Some speculated it was a new type of torpedo or a secret weapon. Others thought it might be parts for a bomber. The wild speculation continued, but no one came close to the truth. Indianapolis reached Pearl Harbor on July the 19th, refueled, and departed the same day. Now came the longest leg Pearl Harbor to Tinian, approximately 300 nautical miles across the open Pacific. Captain McVeigh pushed the ship hard. Indianapolis covered the distance in 6.5 days, an extraordinary performance for a heavy cruiser. The voyage from San Francisco to Tinian took 10 days total, setting a speed record for the route. On the morning of July the 26th, Indianapolis entered the lagoon at Tinian and moored at the dock. Within hours, cranes lifted the wooden crate from the hangar and transferred it to waiting trucks. The lead line cylinder from Captain McVeigh's cabin went into another vehicle. Major Furman and Captain Nolan accompanied the cargo to a heavily guarded compound on the island. They disappeared into a world of fences, armed guards, and security clearances. The mission was complete. Indianapolis had delivered her cargo safely and on time. The crew still did not know what they had carried. Some sailors noticed an unusually large number of high-ranking officers on the dock, which suggested the cargo was important, but that was all they knew. Captain McVeigh received new orders: proceed to Guam, disembark personnel who had completed their tours, then sail to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines for training. From Leyte, Indianapolis would join Vice Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's Task Force 95 off Okinawa for the final push against Japan. The orders were routine. The ship would return to normal Navy operations. Indianapolis remained at Tinian only long enough to offload the cargo. She departed in the early afternoon of July 26th, just hours after arriving. Behind her, on Tinian Manhattan Project, personnel began assembling the L-11 bomb unit. They worked quickly. Little Boy had to be ready within days. The bomb was completed on August 1st. As ground crews loaded it into the B-29 Enola Gay, they inscribed messages on its casing. One of them read, "Greetings to the Emperor from the men of the Indianapolis." Those men by then were dead or dying in the Philippine Sea. After a brief stop at Guam, where some crew members disembarked, Indianapolis departed on July 28, 1945, bound for Leyte Gulf. Her route would take her through the Philippine Sea, a relatively quiet area of ocean. The Japanese fleet had been destroyed. American forces controlled the sea and air. The major combat operations were concentrated farther north around Okinawa and the home islands. Captain McVeigh requested a destroyer escort for the transit. His request was denied. Destroyer escorts were in short supply, needed for higher priority missions. Indianapolis was a warship with experienced crew. She could defend herself. The risk was assessed as low. Navy intelligence had information suggesting Japanese submarine activity along the route, but this information was not clearly communicated to McVeigh. He was warned of the potential presence of submarines, but not told of specific threats. Classified intelligence procedures prevented the sharing of certain information. The system that should have protected Indianapolis instead contributed to her loss. On July 29th, Indianapolis sailed through calm seas under good visibility. The ship was not zigzagging, the evasive maneuver designed to complicate submarine attacks. Captain McVeigh had discretionary orders to zigzag at his discretion. With good visibility and in what he believed to be relatively safe waters, he chose not to zigzag. This decision would later be used against him at his court-martial. Those submarine commanders testified that zigzagging would have made no difference. Shortly after midnight on July 30th, 1945, Indianapolis was approximately halfway between Guam and Leyte, steaming at 17 knots through the Philippine Sea. The moon had set. Visibility was fair but not excellent. Most of the crew was asleep. At 00:15 hours, 2 torpedoes from the Japanese submarine I-58 struck Indianapolis on her starboard side. The first torpedo hit forward, blowing off approximately 40 feet of the bow. The explosion destroyed the forward berthing compartments, killing many men instantly. Others were trapped below as seawater rushed in. The second torpedo struck amidships near the fuel tanks. The explosion was catastrophic. It destroyed the ship's electrical system, knocked out communications, and started massive fires. The forward engine room flooded immediately. Men working there had no chance to escape. Captain McVeigh was thrown from his bunk by the explosions. He rushed to the bridge, but the damage was already apparent. Indianapolis was listing heavily to starboard. The bow was gone. Fires raged amidships. The ship had no power, no lights, no communications. She was dying. McVeigh gave the order to abandon ship, but with communications destroyed, the order could not be transmitted throughout the vessel. Some men heard it by word of mouth. Others made their own decision to abandon ship when the listing became severe. Still others remained at their posts, following Navy tradition, waiting for orders that never came. 12 minutes after the torpedoes struck, Indianapolis rolled to starboard. Her stern rose into the air, and she slipped beneath the waves. Approximately 300 men went down with the ship, trapped in flooded compartments or unable to escape in time. The remaining 90 men were in the water. They wore life jackets if they had time to grab them. Some clung to rafts and debris. Others simply floated, hoping for rescue. Most were coated in heavy bunker fuel oil that had spilled from the ruptured fuel tanks. The oil covered their faces, got in their mouths, stung their eyes. It would become a source of torment in the days ahead. The survivors formed into groups for mutual support. Some groups were organized, led by officers who had survived. Others were simply clusters of men who found each other in the darkness. The largest groups numbered in the hundreds. Smaller groups had only a few dozen men. Some sailors were alone, isolated from their shipmates. As the sun rose on July 30th, the survivors took stock of their situation. They had life jackets, but little else. Only a few rafts had been deployed successfully. Food and water were almost non-existent. Medical supplies were minimal. The men were covered in oil. Many were injured. and they were floating in the open ocean with no idea when or if rescue would come. And none of them knew they had just delivered the atomic bomb. The ordeal that followed has become one of the most terrible survival stories in naval history. The men of Indianapolis spent 4 days and 5 nights in the water, enduring heat-thirst injuries and attacks by sharks. The daytime temperatures were brutal. The sun beat down on men with no shade, no protection. Many had lost their hats in the sinking. The oil covering their skin amplified the sun's effect, causing severe burns and blistering. Men became delirious from heat and dehydration. Some took off their life jackets, convinced they were too hot. They drowned within minutes. The nights brought a different torment. Without the sun, men shivered in the water, hypothermia setting in despite the relatively warm ocean temperature. The combination of heat exposure during the day and hypothermia at night weakened the survivors systematically. Thirst was the worst enemy. Surrounded by water, the men could not drink. Some tried to drink seawater. The result was predictable and terrible. Salt poisoning caused hallucinations, seizures, and death. Men who drank seawater would foam at the mouth as their tongues and lips swelled. They became violent, thrashing in the water, sometimes pulling other men under as they died. Their comrades had to push them away or watch them drown. The sharks came on the first day. Oceanic white-tip sharks, drawn by the noise and blood in the water, began circling the survivors. At first they fed on the dead, but as the days passed and more men died, the sharks grew bolder. They began attacking the living. The attacks were sudden and terrifying. A man would be floating one moment, then pulled under the next. Survivors would see fins cutting through the water, feel something bump against their legs, hear screams as sharks struck. The men kicked at the sharks, splashed and tried to stay in groups. Sharks tended to attack isolated individuals, so staying together offered some protection. But the protection was imperfect. Even in groups, men disappeared. Estimates of shark attack fatalities vary widely, from a few dozen to 150 men. The truth is probably somewhere between. Many men listed as shark attack victims may have died from other causes, dehydration, exposure injuries, and were then scavenged by sharks. But there is no doubt that sharks took living men. Survivors testified to watching their shipmates pulled under. The horror of the shark attacks would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Through all this, the men did not know why they had been on that mission. They did not know about the wooden crate and the lead-lined cylinder. They did not know about uranium-235, or atomic bombs, or Project Manhattan. They knew only that their ship had sunk, they were dying in the ocean, and no one was coming to save them. The tragedy of Indianapolis was compounded by a failure of Navy communications and procedures. When Indianapolis did not arrive at Leyte Gulf as scheduled on July 31st, no one noticed. No one reported her missing. No search was initiated. The port director at Leyte maintained a plotting board tracking ship movements. Indianapolis was on the board, but when she failed to arrive, the port director assumed she had been diverted or delayed. This was common during wartime operations. Ships were often rerouted without advance notice. The procedures did not require reporting non-arrivals of combatant ships. Indianapolis was a warship, not a transport or supply vessel. The system assumed warships could take care of themselves. At Guam, where Indianapolis had last reported, staff knew she was heading to Leyte, but did not track her progress. At Pearl Harbor, Fleet Headquarters had no immediate responsibility for ships in transit between Guam and Leyte. At CINC in Hawaii, Indianapolis was simply one of hundreds of ships moving through the Pacific. No single authority had clear responsibility for noticing her absence. The Navy had received intelligence that might have helped. Shortly after sinking, Indianapolis Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto of submarine I-58 sent a message reporting that he had sunk an American warship. American intelligence intercepted and decrypted the message, but the intelligence officers dismissed it as possibly deceptive or exaggerated. Japanese submarines frequently reported sinking ships they had only damaged or missed entirely. The report was noted but not acted upon. For 4 days, nearly 900 men floated in the Philippine Sea, while the United States Navy did not realize they were missing. It was a catastrophic failure of systems and procedures, and it cost hundreds of lives. On August 2nd, 1945, Lieutenant Wilbur Chuck Gwynn was flying a routine patrol in a PV-1 Ventura bomber. At approximately 11:25 in the morning, while adjusting a radio antenna, Gwynn spotted an oil slick on the ocean surface. This was unusual, but not necessarily alarming. Ships leaked oil. But as Gwynn flew closer, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Men in the water. Dozens of them. Then hundreds. Gwynn immediately radioed his base at Peleliu Men, in the water lots of them coordinates provided. He dropped a life raft and radio transmitter, then circled to guide rescue forces. Lieutenant Richard Atterbury, Gwynn's commanding officer, flew out to relieve him when Gwynn's fuel ran low. The first aircraft to reach the scene, with rescue capability, was a PBY Catalina flying boat, piloted by Lieutenant Commander Adrian Marks. Marks was under orders not to land on the open ocean. It was dangerous, and PBYs could be damaged or lost attempting water landings in rough seas. But when Marks saw men dying in the water, he made the decision to land anyway. Marks landed the PBY in swells and began pulling survivors aboard. He lashed men to the wings when the interior was full. The PBY could not take off again. It was too damaged and overloaded, but it kept men out of the water until ships arrived. The destroyer escort USS Cecil J. Doyle was the first surface vessel to reach the scene. Her captain, Commander W. Graham Claytor Jr., ordered the ship's searchlight turned on as a beacon guiding survivors through the night. Through the evening and into the next day, 7 ships searched the area and pulled survivors from the water. The rescue was as terrible as the ordeal. Men were covered in oil, making them difficult to hold. Many were badly injured. Some had gone mad from dehydration and fought their rescuers. Others were in shock, unable to respond. The ships pulled bodies from the water alongside survivors, many mutilated by sharks. Rescue crews had to fire rifles at sharks to drive them away from the dead. By August 3rd, the search was complete. Of the 195 men aboard Indianapolis, only 316 had survived. The loss was staggering. It was and remains the worst loss of life from a single ship in United States Navy history. The survivors were taken to hospitals on Peleliu and Guam. Most were suffering from severe dehydration exposure and saltwater poisoning. Many had injuries from the explosions. Some would never fully recover from their ordeal. All were traumatized. As they convalesced, the survivors began to learn what had happened in the days since Indianapolis sank. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay had taken off from Tinian and dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. The bomb destroyed the city, killing at least 70,000 people instantly and tens of thousands more from radiation and injuries. It was a weapon unlike anything previously seen in human history. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. World War II was over. In hospitals and aboard recovery ships, the men of Indianapolis learned that they had delivered the bomb. The cargo they had speculated about, the mysterious crate and cylinder, the army officers, the high-priority orders had been components of the atomic weapons that ended the war. The revelation was complicated. The men had helped end the war and saved countless lives that would have been lost in an invasion of Japan. But their ship had been sunk. Their friends had died, and they had endured 4 days of hell. The connection between their suffering and the bomb was direct. If the mission had not been so urgent, perhaps they would have had an escort. Perhaps someone would have noticed when they failed to arrive. Perhaps more men would have survived. But these were questions without answers. The mission had been necessary. The bomb had worked. The war was over, and 879 men were dead. The Navy announced the loss of Indianapolis on August 15, 1945, the same day Japan surrendered. The timing meant the disaster was relegated to the inside pages of newspapers. The victory overshadowed the tragedy, but the Navy could not ignore the loss. A court of inquiry was convened to investigate what had happened and who was responsible. The inquiry concluded that Captain McVeigh should be court-martialed for 2 offences: failing to give timely orders to abandon ship and hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, disagreed with the recommendation and instead issued McVeigh a letter of reprimand. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, overruled Nimitz. King ordered the court-martial to proceed. Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, approved. The court-martial began in December 1945 and lasted 2 weeks. McVeigh was charged with failing to issue timely abandon ship orders and with failing to zigzag. The first charge was quickly dismissed. Witnesses testified that McVeigh had given the order as soon as practical given the circumstances. The second charge was more serious. The prosecution argued that visibility had been good enough to require zigzagging under Navy regulations. McVeigh had discretionary authority to zigzag, but the prosecution claimed conditions mandated it. The defense argued that submarine commanders testified zigzagging made no meaningful difference in evading torpedoes. They presented expert witnesses who said the same. In an extraordinary development, the Navy called Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine commander who had sunk Indianapolis, to testify. Hashimoto stated clearly that zigzagging would not have prevented his attack. He had fired a spread of 6 torpedoes designed to hit, even if the target maneuvered. Whether Indianapolis zigzagged or not, she would have been sunk. Despite Hashimoto's testimony, the court found McVeigh guilty of hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag. The sentence was loss of 100 numbers in his temporary rank of captain and 100 numbers in his permanent rank of commander. The court recommended clemency. Secretary Forrestal remitted the sentence and restored McVeigh to duty. McVeigh continued to serve and retired in 1949 as a rear admiral, but the conviction destroyed him. McVeigh was the only US Navy captain ever court-martialed for losing his ship to enemy action during wartime. He received hate mail from families of the dead blaming him for their sons' deaths. Some letters